A black woman hands over her boarding pass at the airport gate. Ready to board a flight for a critical business trip. But instead of the usual nod and smile, the gate agent pauses his eyes. "Ma'am, this pass has been flagged as suspicious." The murmurs start immediately. Naomi Brooks, a high-profile journalist, stands frozen as passengers glance her way. Judgment already settling in their eyes. She knows this isn't about her ticket. It's about something deeper, something unspoken but paw. Security is called. Minutes stretch into eternity as Naomi stands to the side. Her documents examined under the scrutiny reserved for criminals. Not respected professionals. But just when what happened next left everyone speechless and changed the course of Airline. Stay with me. This story is more than just an incident at the airport. It's about resilience, justice, and what happens when the right person refuses to back down. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to hit subscribe for more eye-open. The airport hums with a kind of rehearsed chaos, the shuffle of hurried feet, the crackle of overhead announcements, the quiet but insistent rustle of paper boarding passes exchanged between hands. Naomi Brooks stands at gate 19, watching the dance unfold. She is familiar with this performance, having been cast in it many times before. Airports are not foreign to her. Neither is suspicion. She adjusts the leather strap of her bag on her shoulder, the weight of the folder inside pulling at her like an anchor. Outside the window, the early morning light spills lazily over the tarmac, painting the planes in shades of dull gold. Naomi stands tall, her back straight, and her tailored blazer sharp against the crowd. There is nothing about her that suggests disorder. Nothing that would cause a reasonable man to look twice. And yet, as she steps forward, handing her boarding pass to the gate agent, she feels the subtle shift in air. The stillness that only comes when someone decides you no longer belong. Brandon Ellis barely looks at the ticket before his brows furrow. His eyes flick up, locking onto Naomi's face as if searching for confirmation of something he already suspects. His fingers grip the pass a second too long. "Ma'am," he says, voice steady but too loud. "Where did you get this ticket?" Naomi's grip tightens around the handle of her bag. She has been here before, different airport, different city, same unwelcome question. "I purchased it online," she replies, calm but firm, like everyone else. Brandon's eyes narrow as if her answer has betrayed some expectation he holds. Behind Naomi, the line grows restless. A businessman checks his watch. A mother hushes her crying child. "This ticket's been flagged," Brandon says, lifting it between his fingers as though he has found a counterfeit bill. "It's suspicious." The word lingers in the air like a sour note. Naomi's gaze hardens. "I wasn't aware that was the airline's official term," she replies coolly. A man in the line behind her mutters, "Just let her through already." Brandon ignores him, gesturing for Naomi to step aside. "Security will handle this," he says. His eyes flicker over her like she is something to be catalogued. Naomi does not argue. Arguing at airports is a quick way to earn the attention of those with guns and badges. She moves to the side, standing with the poise of someone who knows the game and is already weary of it. Minutes pass. Each second stretches longer than the last, pulling the gaze of nearby passengers toward her like a magnet. Naomi can feel the silent questions pressing down on her. She recognizes the looks, the half-curious, half-dismissive glances. She knows the language of the gaze well. It says everything the mouth refuses to. A pair of security officers approaches, one tall and broad, the other shorter, younger, and less certain. The taller man's nameplate reads, Grant. His expression betrays nothing but impatience. "Ma'am," he says, curt, "I need to see some identification." Naomi meets his gaze without blinking. "I showed my ID at security," she says, twice. Grant does not acknowledge her words. His hand remains outstretched, palm open. Naomi reaches into her bag. Withdrawing her passport, she places it in Grant's hand with care, as if the document might shatter under his touch. He flips through the pages slowly, deliberately, the way one reads a contract they do not intend to sign. "This looks fine," he says finally, handing it back. Naomi offers a thin smile. "I could have told you that." But Grant's eyes linger on her bag. "What else are you carrying?" he asks. Naomi's fingers tighten around the strap. "Personal belongings," she replies. "Mind if we take a look?" "Yes," she says plainly. I do mind. Grant smirks. Suspicious behavior's reason enough. Naomi exhales slowly. She knows how this ends if she refuses. Fine, she says, unzipping the bag and carefully pulling out the folder with the gold seal, her lifeline. Her work. The reason she is standing in this airport in the first place. Grant's eyes narrow at the sight of the emblem. What's this? Naomi lifts her chin. Classified government documents. Grant's smirk fades, but suspicion lingers. His partner shifts awkwardly beside him, sensing the line they're towing. You've got proof of that? Grant asks. The seal is the proof, Naomi says, her voice like stone. There is a moment of silence between them, heavy and unrelenting. Grant's hand hesitates near the folder, as if daring to peel back the cover. Naomi's eyes flash, and in that instant, she is no longer standing in an airport. She is in a boardroom. She is in a courtroom. She is on a street corner facing the slow gaze of a police officer. This is not new. This is America. Before Grant can make his decision, a sharp voice cuts through the air. Is there a problem here? Naomi turns to see Daniel Pierce, his badge gleaming under the airport lights. His eyes do not meet Naomi's first. They land on Grant like a gavel. Grant stiffens. Just routine. Sir. Pierce steps closer, gaze locking onto the folder in Grant's hand. His voice drops to a simmer. That, he says carefully, is not something you want to mishandle. Grant's lips press into a thin line, but his fingers release the folder without a word. Naomi takes it back, tucking it into her bag. Her eyes never leave Grant's face. Thank you, Pierce says, turning to Naomi with a nod of respect she rarely encounters in places like this. Ma'am, if you'll follow me, I'll ensure you get to your gate without further delay. As Naomi steps forward, she hears the quiet hum of whispers. The murmurs of passengers who saw everything but understood nothing. And so, she walks on. She always does. Naomi Brooks walked down the terminal beside Daniel Pierce, her polished heels clicking against the tile floor in quiet rhythm. The eyes of the crowd still lingered, trailing behind her like a shadow that refused to detach. There were no words exchanged between them at first. The silence was familiar to Naomi, the kind that came after moments of spectacle, when everyone pretended not to notice what they had all witnessed. The gate was in sight, but Naomi felt the distance stretch longer than it should. Pierce walked with the practiced stride of someone used to extinguishing fires but never questioning why they started in the first place. His presence was more performance than protection. Apologies for the inconvenience, ma'am, Pierce said at last, his tone slipping into that too familiar blend of professional courtesy and thinly veiled discomfort. Naomi let the words hang in the air. She had long since stopped accepting apologies from men who couldn't tell if they were offering them out of regret or obligation. I'm sure it was, she replied, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Pierce glanced at her but said nothing. He didn't need to. Naomi knew that for him, this was over, resolved neatly, tied with the bow of his intervention. But for her, the unraveling had only just begun. At the gate, Brandon Ellis was still stationed behind the counter, posture stiff as if bracing for impact. Naomi met his eyes, holding his gaze longer than necessary. It was the silent confrontation he would remember. Not the folder, not the interruption by Pierce. The attendant scanned her boarding pass without further comment, but the tension lingered, weaving itself into the fabric of the space around her. Naomi stepped onto the jet bridge, finally crossing the threshold that had been so stubbornly guarded minutes ago. Yet, as she walked toward the aircraft door, she felt the same weight return, not in her hands, but on her skin. The cabin was half full. Naomi found her seat near the window, placing her bag carefully beneath the one in front of her. The space beside her remained empty, a small relief in the narrowing corridor of her frustration. She leaned back, watching passengers drift down the aisle. Some avoided her gaze, others let their eyes linger a moment too long. She recognized that gaze curiosity wrapped in assumption. As the plane began boarding the final passengers, a heavy-set man in a beige suit stopped at her row, glancing at the seat beside her. His eyes flicked to her face. Hesitating, Naomi braced for it. The man lingered for just a second longer, then turned and flagged down a flight attendant. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hushed but not enough to escape Naomi's ears. "Is there another seat available? I'd rather not be crammed into a window seat for the whole flight." The attendant, a young woman with blonde hair tied in a neat bun, nodded politely. Naomi watched as they exchanged a few hushed words. But no one bothered to lower their voices completely. "There's a seat in row 11. The attendant said. "Perfect. I'll take it." Naomi didn't react outwardly. She had seen this happen too many times before to let it wound her. But as the man moved away, she felt the familiar sting beneath her ribs. A new passenger slid into the seat beside her, a young black woman who nodded at Naomi with a small smile. Naomi returned it, though it felt more like acknowledgement than connection. The engines began to hum, and Naomi let her eyes drift toward the window. The tarmac stretched out below, but her thoughts wandered further. Mid-flight, Naomi reached for the folder in her bag. She wasn't planning to work, but the weight of it felt grounding in her hands. As she flipped it open, a shadow fell over her shoulder. A flight attendant, not the one from earlier, was standing there, her expression tight but unreadable. "Ma'am," she began cautiously, "I'm going to have to ask you to put that away." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" The attendant's eyes flicked to the golden emblem on the folder. "We've received concerns from a passenger about the material you're handling." Naomi's grip tightened around the folder, her pulse steady but sharp. "Concerns," she repeated, the word thick with incredulity. The attendant shifted awkwardly. They were uncomfortable seeing government documents in the open. Naomi closed the folder slowly. "But she didn't put it away just yet. And I suppose it didn't occur to you to ask why they felt uncomfortable?" The flight attendant swallowed, her professionalism beginning to unravel. Naomi held up a hand, cutting her off. "I know," Naomi said, her voice soft but cutting. "You're just doing your job." The attendant hesitated, but Naomi's eyes never left hers. Eventually, the woman nodded and stepped away, leaving Naomi alone with the hum of the plane and the weight of 1,000 small cuts that bled slower but deeper. As the flight descended, Naomi sat still, the folder tucked neatly back into her bag. The seat beside her remained occupied, but the young woman said nothing. Naomi stared out the window, watching the landscape shrink beneath her. It wasn't the glaring acts of discrimination that chipped away at her. It was the small, almost imperceptible ways the world made it clear she was always just one wrong glance, one wrong movement away from being out of place. When the plane finally touched down, Naomi exhaled quietly. She had crossed the sky, but the distance between where she was and where she was allowed to be never felt longer. The wheels touched down with a soft thud, and the cabin was filled with the familiar rustle of seat belts unfastening prematurely and the impatient shuffle of bodies angling toward the aisle. Naomi Brooks remained seated, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her gaze fixed out the window as the plane rolled toward the terminal. But even as the engines quieted, the weight of the flight did not lift. From the corner of her eye, Naomi noticed the heavy-set man in the beige suit, now comfortably seated 3 rows ahead, turning back to glance in her direction. The look was brief, but it lingered just long enough to mean something. She had seen that gaze before. It was the silent arithmetic of a man measuring his comfort against her presence. She wondered if he knew she had caught him calculating. The line in the aisle thickened as passengers gathered their things. Naomi didn't rush. Airports were like rivers, no matter how quickly one person moved. The current remained the same. Beside her, the young black woman shifted, breaking the silence. "People like him will never say it out loud," she murmured, her voice low enough to keep private but loud enough to cut through the shared understanding between them. Naomi's lips tightened into a thin smile. "They don't need to," she replied. The young woman gave a small nod. "I'm Gabrielle, by the way." "Naomi." As the line inched forward, Gabrielle watched Naomi curiously. "I recognized you earlier," she said. "You wrote that piece for The Atlantic about public housing and redlining." Naomi's smile softened, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I didn't expect to be recognized at 30,000 feet." Gabrielle shrugged. "Black journalists who write about things that make people uncomfortable tend to stand out." Naomi chuckled lightly, shaking her head. "Yes, we do." The line finally began to move. Gabrielle stepped into the aisle, allowing Naomi to follow behind. By the time Naomi reached the terminal, most passengers had already melted into the endless sprawl of the airport. But as she walked through the gate, the man in the beige suit was still lingering near the exit, eyes flicking to her again before pretending to check his phone. It wasn't subtle. It never was. Naomi brushed past him, her pace unhurried but deliberate. As she approached the baggage claim, the terminal's hum grew louder, a familiar chorus of reunions, departures, and the faint overhead call for connecting flights. She thought, perhaps, the day's burdens had finally begun to fade. But as she pulled her phone from her coat pocket, a voice interrupted. "Ma'am, excuse me." Naomi turned slowly, already knowing what she would see. It was a uniformed airport officer, Officer Reynolds, by the glint of his name tag accompanied by the man in the beige suit. Naomi's eyes moved between the two of them, carefully masking the familiar thrum of irritation. "Is there a problem?" she asked. Voice steady. Reynolds shifted his weight. He was young, clean-shaven, and clearly uncomfortable, the kind of officer who would rather be anywhere else but standing in front of her. But duty, or perhaps something more subtle, had placed him there. "This gentleman mentioned some concerns about your behavior during the flight," Reynolds said, gesturing to the man in beige. Naomi's gaze hardened. She looked at the man directly now, her silence daring him to continue. "Is that right?" she asked. Folding her arms, the man straightened his tie, affecting the confidence of someone who hadn't quite prepared to defend his accusation. "I just thought I saw something unusual," he said, eyes drifting toward her bag. "Unusual?" Naomi echoed. "You mean the folder with the government seal?" He hesitated. "Well, I couldn't be sure what it was." Naomi took a step closer, closing the small space between them. "And instead of asking like an adult, you flagged down an officer?" Reynolds cut in, raising his hands slightly as if to diffuse the moment. "Ma'am, we're just following up." Naomi's eyes didn't leave the man in beige. She could see it in his expression, the quiet panic of someone who had stepped too far and was beginning to realize there was no graceful retreat. "Do you know what's in this folder?" Naomi asked Reynolds, finally turning to him. He shook his head. "Classified documents," she said plainly. "For official work." Reynolds nodded slowly, processing the information, but Naomi wasn't finished. "You know," she continued, her voice lowering but gaining weight, "I've been through security. I've been through customs. I've been through gate agents and random checks. And not once did anyone question that folder until this man decided he didn't like the look of me holding it." Reynolds opened his mouth, but Naomi cut him off. "So I'll ask again, do you see a problem here?" The terminal around them seemed quieter now, as if bystanders were leaning in without moving closer. Reynolds glanced at the man in beige, who suddenly seemed very interested in the floor beneath his shoes. "No, ma'am," Reynolds said finally, stepping back. "I don't." Naomi nodded sharply, her eyes lingering just a second longer on the man in beige before turning away. By the time Naomi reached the taxi stand outside, the air was cool against her skin, and the weight on her shoulders felt heavier than the folder in her bag. Gabrielle appeared again, pulling her suitcase behind her. "They really followed you out here?" she asked. Incredulous. Naomi chuckled lightly, though there was no humor in it. "They always do," Naomi said. "But the funny thing about shadows, they disappear under the right light." Gabrielle finished. Naomi smiled, this time genuinely. "They do." Naomi Brooks stepped into the backseat of the taxi, the leather cold beneath her as she settled in, exhaling the weight of the airport behind her. The driver glanced at her through the rearview mirror, his eyes flicking to her reflection like an afterthought. "Where to?" he asked, his voice indifferent, as if the streets of New York were the only thing on his mind. "Midtown," Naomi replied. "The Hilton on 45th. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the stream of traffic that snaked away from the terminal. Naomi let her head rest against the window, watching the city move past her. But the reflection staring back at her felt heavier. The glass carried the residue of the day's events, the officer's hesitation, the man's gaze, the unspoken accusations that followed her like unpaid debts. She knew the game too well to be surprised by it. Airports were merely corridors of performance, places where everyone wore a uniform even if they weren't given one. And Naomi's uniform, whether she liked it or not, was written into the color of her skin. The taxi slowed at a red light near LaGuardia's exit, and Naomi glanced toward the curb. A white woman, middle-aged and flustered, was waving down another cab, dragging a large suitcase behind her. The driver, a South Asian man, his turban neatly tied, hesitated for a moment before pulling over. Naomi watched the exchange unfold, though she could hear nothing. The woman leaned into the window, speaking quickly. gesturing toward the trunk, but something shifted in the cab driver's face. He said something in response, and the woman's expression hardened. Naomi saw it then, the tightening of the woman's lips, the subtle but unmistakable roll of her eyes. It was a gesture Naomi had seen countless times, one that did not need words to translate. By the time the light turned green, the cab had pulled away without her. Naomi watched the woman's face twist in frustration. It wasn't the frustration of being left behind. It was the frustration of not getting what she believed was hers by default. Midtown was busier than usual when Naomi arrived. The taxi driver helped unload her suitcase. But their interaction ended without the small talk or pleasantries that often accompanied such moments. He didn't offer to carry her bag inside. Naomi didn't expect him to. The hotel lobby was warm, but the atmosphere didn't thaw the lingering chill beneath her skin. Naomi crossed the marble floor, her heels clicking with a confidence she sometimes felt obligated to wear like armor. The woman behind the front desk smiled politely, but the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Checking in? Yes. Naomi Brooks. The receptionist's fingers danced across the keyboard, her brows furrowing after a moment. I'm sorry, Ms. Brooks. It seems we don't have your reservation. Naomi's posture straightened. I made the reservation 2 weeks ago, Naomi said calmly. Under my name, Naomi Brooks. The woman's smile thinned, the edges of it curling downward into quiet skepticism. Perhaps you used a different name or card? Naomi could feel the ripple of frustration pressing against the back of her throat. But she swallowed it down. No, I didn't. The receptionist's fingers tapped against the keys again, as if persistence alone would summon Naomi's name from the void. I'm afraid there's nothing here. I could book you a different room, but the rate will be higher. Of course, Naomi thought. Before she could speak, a man in a navy suit stepped to the desk beside her. His presence was unremarkable, yet it commanded the receptionist's immediate attention in a way Naomi's had not. I believe I have a reservation, the man said smoothly, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had never been told otherwise. The receptionist's smile returned genuine this time as she nodded. Of course, Mr. Callahan. One moment. Naomi didn't move. The keystrokes were quicker for him. There was no confusion, no searching. His room was waiting. As Mr. Callahan accepted his key card, Naomi finally spoke, her voice cutting cleanly through the air. I'd like to see the manager. The receptionist's eyes flicked up, her mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. Naomi waited. She wasn't loud, wasn't confrontational. She didn't need to be. The weight of her request carried itself. Within minutes, the manager emerged, a short, balding man with glasses perched low on his nose. Is there a problem? He asked, his tone rehearsed in its neutrality. Naomi didn't look at him immediately. She kept her gaze fixed on the receptionist, forcing the young woman to meet her eyes. Yes, Naomi said finally, her voice even but sharp. The problem seems to be that my reservation doesn't exist. The manager frowned, stepping behind the desk to review the screen. It didn't take long. Within moments, Naomi's reservation was found mysteriously misplaced but now conveniently restored. There it is, the manager said, glancing at the receptionist. Apologies, Ms. Brooks. We'll upgrade you to a suite for the inconvenience. Naomi accepted the keycard, sliding it into her bag without a word. In the elevator, Naomi stood alone. The soft ding of each passing floor was the only sound that filled the silence. She stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls, studying the familiar face that stared back. She wasn't angry, not exactly. What she felt was older than anger, more persistent. It was the quiet exhaustion of knowing that even in the absence of outright hostility, prejudice wore 1,000 disguises. It hid behind politeness, slipped through the cracks of professionalism, and wrapped itself in the warmth of hollow smiles. Naomi adjusted her blazer, smoothing the fabric with careful hands. She wasn't surprised by what had happened. The world had not changed. It had merely grown more polite about the ways it bound people like her. Naomi Brooks stood in the hallway outside her hotel suite, the key card pressed lightly between her fingers. The gold-plated numbers on the door 2204 reflected the overhead light in a way that felt deliberate, as if reminding her that she had arrived at the place she had been assigned. She slipped the card into the slot. The soft green glow of acceptance flickered, and the lock clicked open with a muted finality. The room was spacious, As promised, a king-sized bed sat against the far wall, the city lights spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows like distant constellations. Everything was arranged neatly, glassware on the desk, freshly folded towels perched near the sink, a mint resting on the pillow like an afterthought. Naomi set her bag down beside the bed and let out a slow breath. But the room, for all its comfort, felt tight. The walls seemed closer, the air slightly heavier, as if she had carried something in with her that no concierge could unpack. She walked to the window, pressing her palms lightly against the cool glass. Below, the city glowed in its endless rhythm. Taxi lights flickered down the avenues. Pedestrians threaded through crosswalks, and storefronts illuminated faces she could not see clearly. New York had always been a strange contradiction to Naomi, a place where anonymity was supposed to mean freedom. Yet it often felt like a magnifying glass held too close to her skin. A faint knock echoed from the door, cutting through her thoughts. Naomi frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, a young bellhop stood there, balancing a small silver tray with a single glass of water and a folded card. "Compliments of the hotel," he said, his voice polite but distant. Naomi's gaze flicked to the card before she took it. She didn't thank him, and he didn't wait for her to. The door clicked shut behind her, and Naomi leaned against it, unfolding the card with slow, careful hands. It read simply, "Ms. Brooks, we apologize for the earlier misunderstanding. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask. Management." Naomi smirked. A misunderstanding. It was always a misunderstanding. She placed the card on the desk beside the untouched mint and let it sit there, as useless as the glass of water it had arrived with. Later that evening, Naomi wandered into the hotel lounge, drawn by the low hum of conversation that drifted through the air like smoke. She wasn't in the mood to drink, but she wanted to be around people, to observe the casual ease with which they existed in spaces she had spent a lifetime navigating like tightropes. The bar was lined with dark leather stools, half of them occupied by men who carried their drinks the way they carried their confidence, loosely, as if neither could spill. Naomi slid onto an empty stool near the corner. The bartender, a tall, olive-skinned man with a trimmed beard, approached her, wiping his hands with a white cloth. "What can I get you?" "Bourbon." "Neat." He nodded, reaching for the bottle without hesitation. There was no doubt in his movement, no lingering glance at her to see if she could afford it. That, at least, was something. As the glass slid across the counter toward her, Naomi noticed him watching the television mounted near the far end of the bar. The evening news flickered across the screen, showing grainy footage of a protest somewhere in the Midwest. A familiar image: the raised signs, the chanting crowds, the long line of police officers standing like statues filled the screen. Naomi took a slow sip of her drink, the burn settling in her chest as the bartender spoke, his eyes still fixed on the broadcast. "Crazy, isn't it?" he said, shaking his head slightly. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "What part?" she asked, her voice soft but pointed. The bartender turned toward her, as if realizing for the first time that he had an audience. His expression shifted, but not quickly enough. "Oh, I just mean, all of it," he said, gesturing vaguely at the screen. "People shutting down streets, blocking traffic, doesn't seem like the best way to get things done." Naomi let his words sit between them, untouched like the card upstairs. "Maybe it's the only way people notice," she replied. The bartender hesitated, wiping the counter even though it was already clean. "I guess," he said, "but still, sometimes it feels like it just makes things worse." "You know?" Naomi's gaze lingered on him, not in anger but in quiet study. She had heard this before, countless times, the polite dismissal of unrest, wrapped in the thin veil of common sense. "You know," Naomi said, setting her glass down gently, "the thing about protests is that they're not designed to make anyone comfortable." The bartender's eyes flicked toward hers, unsure whether to engage or retreat. "I suppose that's true," he said. Naomi didn't press further. She didn't need to. The weight of the conversation was already shifting, pulling at the edges of the man's certainty. As Naomi left the lounge, stepping back into the quiet hallway, she felt the familiar hum beneath her skin, the sensation that followed her after these encounters. It wasn't anger. It was the quiet frustration of living in a world that mistook politeness for fairness. That believed civility could smooth the jagged edges of prejudice. The walls of the hotel stretched around her, elegant but indifferent, and as Naomi walked back to her room, she knew that tomorrow, she would carry this weight again. Because the world had not changed. It had simply learned how to hold the keys without ever unlocking the doors. Morning broke over the city in shades of muted gold, filtering through the curtains of Naomi Brooks's hotel room. She sat at the small desk by the window, stirring a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Her laptop sat open, glowing faintly in the half-light, but the document on the screen remained untouched. It wasn't writer's block. Naomi knew that particular brand of silence well. This was something else. She glanced at the crumpled apology card from the hotel manager, still resting on the desk. It hadn't moved since the night before, and neither had the weight pressing against her chest. There was something exhausting about apologies when they arrived dressed in diplomacy. They were not invitations to accountability but quiet requests for silence, asking those wronged to accept decorum as a substitute for change. Naomi took a long breath, willing herself to focus. She was here to cover a summit on economic reform, but the day before had unraveled something deeper, a thread she couldn't ignore. As she stood, her phone vibrated against the desk, flashing a number she didn't recognize. Hello? The voice on the other end was clipped but professional. Ms. Brooks, this is Richard Callahan from the Department of Transportation. I'm calling regarding an incident flagged during your flight yesterday. Naomi's grip tightened around the phone. I wasn't aware the Department of Transportation monitored middle-aged men with fragile egos, she said, her voice measured but sharp. A pause. Callahan cleared his throat, his discomfort rustling over the line. No, ma'am, the issue is related to classified documents you were reportedly carrying. We were contacted by the airline, and they've asked us to verify the nature of those materials. Naomi's jaw tightened. She could hear the weight of his hesitation, the careful balance between protocol and something quieter, more insidious. I wasn't aware passengers were required to explain their work to strangers on flights, she said. Normally, they aren't, Callahan replied, but there was concern. Naomi cut him off, her patience thinning. Concern, she repeated. I see, and I suppose it's standard procedure for this concern to surface after I've cleared security. Been seated, and landed safely? Callahan hesitated. Naomi could almost picture him, sitting in a windowless office, fingers tapping nervously against a desk cluttered with forms no one would ever read. Ms. Brooks, he began carefully, I'm sure you understand we're just following up to ensure no breach of protocol occurred. Naomi let the silence linger a beat too long. Tell me something, Mr. Callahan, she said softly. How many white passengers were flagged for carrying folders with gold seals yesterday? The quiet that followed was enough to answer the question. An hour later, Naomi sat in the back of another taxi, weaving through the veins of the city toward the summit's venue. The conference hall loomed ahead, an expanse of glass and steel, its polished facade reflecting the sky in distorted shapes. A line of attendees filed toward the entrance, their lanyards swaying with each step. As Naomi stepped onto the sidewalk, a voice called her name. Ms. Brooks? She turned to see Gabrielle approaching, dressed sharply in a navy blazer. I thought I might run into you, Gabrielle said with a smile. Naomi returned the smile, though her mind was elsewhere. I'm beginning to think this city isn't big enough for the two of us, Naomi replied, her tone light but carrying an undercurrent of fatigue. Gabrielle's expression shifted. She caught the weight in Naomi's voice, the same weight she herself carried in rooms where she did not need to speak to be noticed. Rough morning? Gabrielle asked. Naomi hesitated, debating whether to dismiss it or share the truth. I received a call from the Department of Transportation, Naomi said. Apparently, carrying classified documents makes people nervous these days. Gabrielle's eyes narrowed. Let me guess, some man on your flight? Naomi nodded. Gabrielle sighed, shaking her head. It never ends, does it? No, Naomi replied quietly. It doesn't. The summit hall was a sea of voices, men in tailored suits, women in heels that clicked across marble floors, conversations floating like smoke from one circle to the next. Naomi drifted through it, her eyes scanning the crowd with the practiced gaze of someone who had spent her life cataloging rooms like these. The panel she was scheduled to cover wouldn't begin for another hour. But Naomi was already tired. She found a corner near the back of the hall, leaning against a marble pillar, her notepad tucked beneath her arm. Before long, Richard Callahan appeared. Naomi recognized him immediately from his stiff posture and the way his eyes scanned the room as if expecting resistance. He spotted her, approaching with the caution of a man crossing thin ice. "Ms. Brooks," he greeted, extending his hand. "I wanted to introduce myself properly." Naomi shook his hand, her grip firm. "Mr. Callahan," she replied, "I appreciate the effort, but I'm not sure there's much to discuss." Callahan's smile was thin. "I wanted to apologize for the call this morning. We were simply doing our job." Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your job?" she echoed. "I thought your job was transportation, not interrogating journalists in hotel rooms." Callahan's smile faltered. "I understand how it might have looked," he said carefully, "but these are complicated times." Naomi held his gaze, her expression unyielding. "No, Mr. Callahan," she said softly, "times have always been complicated. You're just starting to notice." Callahan said nothing. Naomi let the silence stretch, then stepped away, her heels echoing softly across the floor. That evening, Naomi returned to her hotel room, the weight of the day pressing heavily against her shoulders. She stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker below. Her phone buzzed on the desk, another unknown number. Naomi let it ring. Some battles, she decided, didn't need to be answered right away. Naomi Brooks sat at the edge of her hotel bed, the city pulsing faintly beyond the window. The room was quiet, but the silence wasn't restful. It was the silence that followed her everywhere, a silence that whispered things left unsaid, that pressed itself into the hollow spaces of polite exchanges and tight-lipped smiles. The call from Richard Callahan still lingered in the air, like the faint echo of footsteps long after someone had left the room. Naomi had declined to return his follow-up messages. She knew where those conversations led, down narrow corridors lined with apologies that asked her to share the burden of their discomfort. She stood, smoothing the front of her blazer, and picked up the thin folder resting on the desk. Inside were the notes for tomorrow's panel: economic policy proposals. Dry and clinical, but the weight of the folder wasn't in the words printed on the page. It was the golden seal that sat at the top corner, the one that had made men nervous at 30,000 feet. Naomi tucked the folder under her arm and left the room. The hotel's conference floor stretched out in quiet opulence. Crystal chandeliers dangled above, casting soft light that melted into the marble floors. Naomi passed small clusters of guests gathered near the bar, their laughter low and knowing. As she approached the registration table for the evening's pre-panel reception, she caught the faint hesitation in the attendant's eyes. The woman smiled, but it was the kind of smile Naomi had grown familiar with, the kind meant to disguise the flicker of surprise. "Good evening," the woman said, scanning the list. "Are you here for the Economic Reform Summit?" "I am," Naomi replied, giving her name. The woman's fingers hesitated on the page, trailing just long enough for Naomi to notice. "Ah, here you are," the woman said, circling Naomi's name with a tight flourish. "You're listed as press." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "I'm on the panel," she corrected, her voice calm but sharp enough to turn a few heads nearby. The attendant's eyes widened slightly. "Oh, of course," she stammered. "I must have misread." Naomi's gaze lingered for a second longer. Then she took the name tag offered to her. But as she walked away, she could still feel the attendant's eyes follow her, the weight of doubt trailing behind like an unwelcome guest. The reception hall hummed with conversation, a steady current of voices swimming through the air. Naomi drifted along the edges, watching the clusters of men in tailored suits lean into one another, their words filling the space between sips of bourbon and dry jokes exchanged too easily. It was a room she had stepped into many times before, rooms where the most dangerous thing was not what was said, but what was assumed. A tall man approached her, his silver hair swept neatly back, a glass of whiskey cradled in one hand. "Naomi Brooks," he said, offering a thin smile. "I read your piece on housing reform last year. You've stirred up quite the conversation." Naomi nodded politely. "I imagine stirring is the easy part," she replied. He chuckled, but the laughter didn't reach his eyes. "These issues take time," he said, as if explaining patience to a child. "Sometimes pushing too hard can alienate the people you need to bring to the table." Naomi sipped her drink slowly. "Funny," she said. "I always thought those people had enough seats already." The man's smile thinned. Before he could respond, a voice called out from across the room. Naomi. Gabrielle appeared at her side, her expression a mixture of relief and amusement. I was starting to think I'd have to fight off some of these senators myself. Gabrielle said softly, just loud enough for the man to hear. Naomi smiled, grateful for the interruption. I appreciate the backup, Naomi replied. The man offered a faint nod and slipped back into the crowd, leaving the two women standing near the edge of the room. Gabrielle glanced at him over her shoulder. They always find you first, don't they? She mused. They can't help it, Naomi said. Curiosity is a powerful thing. Gabrielle leaned against the bar, watching the room with a quiet intensity. Sometimes I wonder, Gabrielle said, if these rooms will ever stop feeling like we're guests at someone else's party. Naomi followed her gaze. Across the room, a cluster of men in dark suits laughed, the kind of laughter that carried the weight of shared secrets and unspoken rules. They won't, Naomi replied, because they don't see it as their party. They see it as their house. Gabrielle exhaled slowly. Then maybe it's time to stop knocking. Naomi smiled faintly. I stopped knocking a long time ago, she said, but even when you stop knocking, the door has a way of reminding you it's not yours. The reception wound down slowly, the crowd thinning as the evening stretched on. Naomi lingered near the exit, her thoughts distant as she watched the last stragglers make their way to the elevators. Gabrielle appeared beside her again, holding 2 glasses of champagne. For surviving the evening, Gabrielle said, handing one over. Naomi took the glass with a smirk. To survival, Naomi said. They clinked glasses, the faint sound lost in the vastness of the room. As Naomi sipped, she glanced down at the golden seal embossed on her folder. It was a small thing, really just ink and paper. But in the right hands, it could feel heavier than stone. And in the wrong hands, it could feel like a weapon. Naomi set the glass down gently. The room was empty now, but she could still hear the echoes of the conversations that had filled it. She knew tomorrow would bring more questions, more quiet exclusions wrapped in careful smiles. But Naomi had never been one to leave quietly. And she didn't plan to start now. The rain came softly against the hotel window, tapping like fingertips against glass. Naomi Brooks sat at the edge of the bed, her phone pressed to her ear. Though the call had long since ended, the voice of Richard Callahan still lingered, his parting words looping faintly in her mind. I appreciate your cooperation, Ms. Brooks. I'm sure we can avoid any further misunderstandings. Naomi let the phone slip from her hand onto the desk, where it landed with a dull thud. There was something about the way men like Callahan spoke that left little room for argument. They spoke in the language of policy and protocol, of misunderstandings and missteps. But Naomi knew better. The world Callahan moved through was not built on misunderstandings. It was built on the quiet certainty that some doors would open easily while others would wait, locked from the inside, until the right hands turned the key. Naomi's hands were not the right ones. She rose, crossing the room to the window. The city stretched out beneath her, slick and restless beneath the glow of streetlights. Somewhere down there, Gabrielle was likely still at the bar, entertaining conversations Naomi had quietly excused herself from. The panel was tomorrow, but Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that she had already given the most important answers. The next morning, the rain had passed, but the city air still carried the heaviness that often followed it. Naomi arrived at the conference hall early, the weight of the folder under her arm as persistent as the gazes that met her upon arrival. She could feel it, the silent assessments, the flicker of recognition paired with the lingering question of why she was there at all. Naomi wasn't dressed to be ignored. Her blazer was sharp, the gold of her earrings catching the soft light as she moved through the corridor. But there was something else she wore, something unspoken. She took her seat at the long table at the front of the room, where 5 panelists sat beneath the glow of overhead lights. To her left was Senator William Harlow, a man who wore his privilege like a second skin, his voice already filling the space with well-rehearsed answers to questions no one had yet asked. Naomi's nameplate sat in front of her, its printed letters crisp but faint against the polished wood. A young woman, the moderator, stepped to the podium, clearing her throat softly. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for today's panel on economic policy reform. She began, her voice measured but bright. We're honored to have with us leaders in their fields, including Senator William Harlow and journalist Naomi Brooks. The applause was polite, but Naomi caught at the slight delay before her name left the woman's mouth. As if it had momentarily escaped her. It was a small thing. But Naomi knew the weight of small things. The questions began predictably. Harlow answered first, his voice thick with the kind of certainty that could only grow in places untouched by doubt. Naomi listened, folding her hands over her notepad, though she hadn't written a word. It wasn't until the moderator addressed her directly that Naomi lifted her gaze. Ms. Brooks, the woman began, in your recent work, you've drawn attention to the intersection of race and economic inequality. How do you respond to critics who suggest that economic policy should be colorblind, that we risk deepening divisions by focusing on race in these discussions? Naomi's expression didn't shift. She had heard this before. Dressed in different words but cut from the same cloth. Race, Naomi began, her voice calm but deliberate, is not the obstacle to economic progress. It is the litmus test. The room quieted. You see, she continued, people like to speak of colorblindness as if it is a virtue, as if ignoring the lines that divide us somehow erases them. But I have never met a policy that did not know the color of the hands that shaped it. Naomi let her eyes drift toward Harlow, whose smile had tightened ever so slightly. This country was not built on colorblindness, she said. It was built on the quiet, deliberate separation of those who belonged and those who did not. And even now, long after the ink on those old laws has faded, their shadows remain. A ripple passed through the audience. But Naomi wasn't finished. To ask why race is part of this conversation, she said, is to ignore the fact that race was part of the foundation upon which this economy stands. The moderator nodded slowly, her eyes flicking nervously toward the next question on her notecard. But Naomi wasn't watching her. She was watching the faces in the crowd, the men who shifted in their seats, the women who scribbled notes without looking up. Harlow cleared his throat softly. Well, he began, his voice warm but edged with condescension. I think we can all agree that history is important. But I'd like to believe that progress is not measured by how often we revisit the past but by how we move forward. Naomi smiled faintly. That's a convenient belief, she replied, but the past isn't behind us, Senator. It's beneath us. And if you don't know where to look, you'll mistake the cracks in the foundation for progress. The room was silent. Harlow said nothing. Naomi glanced at the moderator, nodding slightly. You can go to the next question, she said softly. After the panel, Naomi lingered near the back of the hall, sipping the last of her coffee as guests filtered out. Gabrielle found her, grinning as she approached. You didn't hold back, Gabrielle said, her voice low but admiring. Naomi shrugged. Why should I? Gabrielle leaned in slightly. Harlow looked ready to bolt. Naomi chuckled softly, shaking her head. Men like him don't run, she said. They wait for the room to empty and pretend they never heard you. Gabrielle's smile faded. So what now? She asked. Naomi glanced down at the gold seal on her folder, her fingers tracing its edge thoughtfully. Now, she said, we make sure they can't pretend anymore.